Be the light that helps others see. Anonymous. Welcome, dear friends, in this video where we will explore the meaning and significance of seeing flashes of spiritual light. Have you ever experienced a sudden burst of light in your vision, like a star or a spark, that lasted for a few seconds and then disappeared? Have you wondered what it was and what it meant for you? If so, you are not alone. Many people have reported seeing flashes of spiritual light, and they are often signs of a higher guidance, a divine presence, or a spiritual awakening. Flashes of spiritual light are not the same as the flashes of light that occur due to physical causes, such as eye problems, migraines, or head injuries. Flashes of spiritual light are usually more subtle, more colorful, and more meaningful. They are not random or accidental, but rather intentional and purposeful. They are messages from the spirit realm, from your angels, guides, or higher self, that are meant to capture your attention, to communicate with you, and to guide you on your path. Seeing flashes of spiritual light is related to our spiritual growth, because it indicates that we are becoming more aware of the subtle energies and dimensions that exist beyond our physical reality. Flashes of spiritual light can also signify that we are receiving guidance, healing, or messages from the spirit realm, which can help us to evolve and progress on our spiritual path. Flashes of spiritual light can also reflect our own inner light, our soul essence, and our divine connection, which can inspire us to live more authentically, joyfully, and purposefully. Flashes of spiritual light are therefore signs of spiritual awakening, transformation, and enlightenment. But what do these flashes of spiritual light mean? How can you interpret them and use them to enhance your spiritual growth? In this session, we will discuss 10 possible meanings of seeing flashes of spiritual light, and how you can apply them to your life. These are: confirmation. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are thinking about something, making a decision, or asking a question. This is a way of the spirit realm to confirm that you are on the right track, that you are aligned with your true self, and that you are following your intuition. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of approval, encouragement, and support. It is telling you to trust yourself and to go ahead with your plans. Protection. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are in a situation of danger, risk, or challenge. This is a way of the spirit realm to protect you from any harm or negativity. They are surrounding you with their light and love, and shielding you from any evil or ill will. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of safety, security, and peace. It is telling you that you are not alone, that you are loved, and that you are safe. Healing. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are in need of healing on a physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual level. This is a way of the spirit realm to heal you with their energy and grace. They are sending you their healing vibrations and transforming you into a new and better version of yourself. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of healing, of release, and of transformation. It is telling you that you are being healed, that you are letting go of what no longer serves you, and that you are becoming a new and better version of yourself. Connection. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are missing or thinking of a loved one who has passed away, or who is in another dimension. This is a way of the spirit realm to connect you with your loved one, and to let you know that they are still with you. They are showing you their presence, their love, and their communication. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of connection, of love, and of communication. It is telling you that they are with you, that they are watching over you, and that they are sending you a message. Consciousness. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are expanding your consciousness, your awareness, and your perception. This is a way of the spirit realm to enlighten you, to awaken you, and to ascend you. They are opening your third eye, your pineal gland, and your crown chakra, and allowing you to access higher dimensions, higher frequencies, and higher realities. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of enlightenment, of awakening, and of ascension. It is telling you that you are opening your third eye, that you are accessing higher dimensions, and that you are raising your vibration. Abundance. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are attracting abundance, prosperity, and wealth into your life. This is a way of the spirit realm to manifest your desires, to attract your goals, and to create your reality. They are aligning you with the law of attraction, the law of abundance, and the law of creation, and helping you to focus on what you want, to feel as if you already have it, and to act as if you deserve it. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of manifestation, of attraction, and of creation. It is telling you that you are aligning with the law of attraction, that you are focusing on what you want, and that you are creating your reality. Purpose. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are discovering your purpose, your mission, and your destiny. This is a way of the spirit realm to guide you, to direct you, and to clarify you. They are showing you your passion, your soul, and your potential, and helping you to find your path, to follow your heart, and to fulfill your potential. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of guidance, of direction, and of clarity. It is telling you that you are finding your passion, that you are following your soul, and that you are fulfilling your potential. Joy. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are experiencing joy, happiness, and bliss. This is a way of the spirit realm to celebrate with you, to appreciate with you, and to congratulate with you. They are sharing your joy, your gratitude, and your achievement, and helping you to enjoy your life, to live in the present, and to celebrate your success. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of gratitude, of appreciation, and of celebration. It is telling you that you are enjoying your life, that you are living in the present, and that you are celebrating your achievements. Warning. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are in a situation of danger, risk, or challenge. This is a way of the spirit realm to warn you, to caution you, and to alert you. They are showing you the potential consequences, the possible pitfalls, and the imminent threats, and helping you to be careful, to pay attention, and to prepare yourself. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of danger, of risk, and of challenge. It is telling you that you need to be careful, that you need to pay attention, and that you need to prepare yourself. Miracle. You may see a flash of light spiritual when you are witnessing a miracle, a wonder, or a blessing. This is a way of the spirit realm to amaze you, to surprise you, and to bless you. They are showing you something extraordinary, something synchronistic, and something divine, and helping you to experience the magic, the mystery, and the majesty of life. The flash of light spiritual is a sign of magic, of synchronicity, and of divinity. It is telling you that you are experiencing something extraordinary, that you are part of something bigger, and that you are connected to something higher. But how can you develop the ability to see flashes of spiritual light? The best way to develop the ability to see flashes of spiritual light is to practice meditation, prayer, or other spiritual exercises that can enhance your perception, awareness, and vibration. By doing so, you can open your mind, your heart, and your soul to the subtle energies and dimensions that exist beyond our physical reality. You can also cultivate a positive attitude, a trusting faith, and a receptive mind that can attract and recognize flashes of spiritual light. By doing so, you can align yourself with the spirit realm and invite their presence and assistance into your life. Seeing flashes of spiritual light is a wonderful and meaningful experience that can enrich your spiritual growth and development. Flashes of spiritual light are signs of your spiritual connection, communication, and guidance. They are gifts from the spirit realm, and they are here to help you on your spiritual journey. These are some of the possible meanings of seeing flashes of spiritual light, but they are not the only ones. You may have your own interpretation, based on your intuition, your experience, and your context. The important thing is to pay attention to these flashes of spiritual light, to acknowledge them, and to thank them. They are gifts from the spirit realm, and they are here to help you on your spiritual journey. Have you ever seen flashes of spiritual light? What did they look like, and how did they make you feel? What do you think they meant for you? Please share your comments below and let me know what you think. I also want to thank you for your support and encouragement. You are the reason why I do what I do. You are the light that helps me see. You are the inspiration that motivates me to create daily videos for you. You are the community that I cherish and appreciate. Without you, none of this would be possible. So thank you for being here, for being you, and for being awesome.